we have to be very careful not to sleepwalk or emotionally outburst ourselves into another broad regional conflict that in the Middle East that the U.S. is enmeshed in with ground troops or otherwise.
We've talked about this, obviously, in the last couple of weeks, or the last week or so, with Israel-Hamas.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a big difference between Ukraine and Russia.
Big difference.
In that Hamas is a terrorist organization where the extermination of all Jews is in their charter. And I don't necessarily think
Israel matters to our national interest more than Ukraine does.
Yes, sure. They do. As a matter of fact, they certainly do matter to our national interest. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't an argument to be made, and we ran the numbers. If we cut the funding to all of the nations with who we provide foreign aid to. And by the way, those numbers are always a very low estimate when you actually understand also the incentives, and Israel as well, that they would come out ahead because we fund a bunch of people who want to wipe them off the face of the map. Or help Israel a little bit and cut money anyways to places like Iran.
The analogy you're drawing is an interesting one. Elon has drawn this analogy with respect to electric vehicle subsidies, where if you got rid of all electric vehicle subsidies, Tesla comes out ahead because the unit economics actually work.
Well, that's because they've sold too many Teslas. That's why they don't get the subsidy anymore. I think it's after 250,000 sold, the subsidy goes away. So it's like, so I sold good cars.
And the unit economics are just more solid in terms of how they're running the operation. So here's what I would say. I think that this is a moment right now, when we're having this conversation now, where we need rational, cool-headed responses to ask, yes, how do we support Israel's own right to its own national self-defense, as Israel is fully entitled to? Yeah. What happened, what Hamas did was barbaric, it was wrong, it was inhumane, it was medieval in its nature. Mm-hmm. Israel absolutely has the right to national self-existence and to fully defend itself. That's a decision for Israel as to how they go about doing it. And our job is diplomatically, in terms of intelligence sharing, in terms of limited circumstances of munition support. That is our job as a partner and ally at the UN. Tell the UN you're not going to draw some false equivalence between Israel's defense.
Ceasefire.
Yeah, exactly. All that nonsense.
Oh, it's the most ridiculous thing.
It's the most ridiculous thing.
Hey, ceasefire. I was just raped, though. Yeah, but now it's a ceasefire.
Ceasefire, exactly. Yeah. Selective timing of this.
I'm still sure.
So our job is diplomatically to stand against all that nonsense. But I don't want to be one of these people shrieking. I mean, Nikki Haley was screeching on air, finish them. With a vague reference to almost Iran was what she invoked right before she said that. And then you talk about Mike Pence, just do it. It's like a Nike. Finish them is from like Mortal Kombat.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Just do it is like a Nike slogan. So they're like misappropriating corporate slogans as though that's our foreign. Lindsey Graham, he said something equivalent to this.
Now, to be fair, I did say kill every last one of Hamas. Absolutely. Every last member of Hamas.
And that's Israel's decision to make.
Right.
And so Israel's making those decisions. I trust them to do the right thing. But we have to be very careful not to sleepwalk or emotionally outburst ourselves into another broad regional conflict that in the Middle East that the U.S. is enmeshed in with ground troops or otherwise. This is when we've made our worst foreign policy disastrous mistakes in the past. So if I'm talking to Bibi, I would say, listen up, we got your back. Mm-hmm. You're on the right side of this. Don't let anybody stand in your way from defending yourself, and we've got your back on that. But my advice to you would be that we've made some of our poorest decisions in the wake of real disaster. That was your 9/11. We had our 9/11 here. And we entered disastrous multi-decade commitments in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And 20 years later, it did not do us an iota of good.
There's a little bit of a difference, though, I will say.
And so just be careful.
Yeah, be careful. Say. But if you're comparing it as a percentage of the population, I think it would roughly
36 times, what it was.
Yeah, 20 to 30-something thousand Americans. And they live right there, and it's never,
But here's all I would say is, though, let's say, as awful as this would have been, as 30 times as many people died on 9/11 as they did.
And Canada did it.
Well, going to Iraq still has nothing to do with that. Right. So I'm just making the point that we've made some of our worst decisions in response to emotional reactions to really, truly disastrous things that needed to be dealt with.
Right.
Targeted response, get rid of bin Laden, get rid of the Taliban. Absolutely. Get rid of Al-Qaeda hiding in the caves, the people who were responsible for this, which, by the way, was a far more complicated story than the U.S. government let out until the declassified files came out 20 years later.
Sure.
Go actually get the real job done rather than using an emotional response to do something that literally might be an orthogonal objective, but in the mental haze and in the mental fog of war, we've made some of our worst decisions, so have other countries in their history. That's Israel's decision to make, but my job as the next U.S. president is to look after American interests, and I do not think we want to be entrenched in another long, drawn-out, U.S.-involved regional broad conflict in the Middle East that would not advance American interests, but there are easy ways we ought to support Israel diplomatically with intelligence sharing. I mean, heck, we don't even have an ambassador to Israel right now. Confirm an ambassador to Israel and Egypt and other countries where we don't have confirmed ambassadors right now.
Can we start with, like, no money to Iran at all?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And no money to Hamas.
Yeah.
$6 billion back.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, but even indirect aid to Hamas that's actually been going through in the name of humanitarian aid or otherwise.
Yeah, right.
Deport anybody in this country who has had any ties to Hamas or otherwise, extradite them to Israel. So there are things we ought to absolutely be doing.
I know.
But there's also some things that nobody else is talking about that we ought to be talking about. We have to make sure that we oversee full phase out through the monitoring and agreements of Iran's nuclear program. But what the heck are we thinking with the Biden administration, with some Republicans cheering it along, talking about nuclear technology transfer to Saudi Arabia?
Yeah.
We should not want nuclear proliferation of any kind in the Middle East, and definitely not in Iran, but not in Saudi Arabia either. And yet nobody's talking about that right now. So I think this is a moment for level-headed rationality rather than emotional knee-jerk responses. And now it's a cool thing, right? It's what the cool kids do, criticize the Iraq War 20 years ago in either party. It's the cool, easy thing to do because it's long past and there's no consequence to you to do it. I'm not patting myself on the back. I was in college at the time, but I was against the Iraq War then. I had a bunch of other harebrained ideas that I was dead wrong on, but that wasn't one of them.
Yeah.
And that was a left-wing position then, even though I wasn't on the left. I consider myself a libertarian back then. But now it's easy to do that now. But the hard part is in the thick and the heat of the moment to make sure you don't make that same mistake, but it's not going to relate to Iraq. It might relate to Iran or a broader regional conflict in the Middle East. And that's the moment to think rationally. How do you do the right thing in supporting Israel to do what it needs to do to defend its national self-existence? But at the same time as the U.S. look after our interests to make sure that we don't accidentally tripwire ourselves into some large protracted conflict in the Middle East. Now is the moment to think with that level of clarity and reason rather than what I see as really lazy responses from all over the political spectrum. The far left trying to create this false moral equivalence between Israel and their enemies. That's wrong. But you got people in the old neocon right that have no muscle memory other than just effectively pounding the drums for war without asking the question of the why we're doing exactly what we're doing. Yeah. And so back to the question of foreign policy experience, I don't think somebody with the foreign policy experience record of the last 25 years should be in charge of making those decisions. I think it should be somebody of my generation coming from the outside, and in this race, that's me.
When the track record is bad, it's not much of a track record. I still do believe kill every single last one of them as far as it relates to Hamas. Doesn't necessarily, by the way, they don't need our money to do it, but they certainly need our moral support. I think you had a follow-up.
The only thing I would say there is just be careful to think that's not the end of the road there, because Hamas is just a client of broader forces that are wielding them like Hezbollah. So it's the Taliban story. The Taliban 20 years later still now in charge.
Yeah, but you know what? When they kidnap your women and children and cut off their heads, it's a good start. It's not, and I don't mean that irrationally. I mean, Hamas, look, this is in their, it's different. It's in their charter, right? Yeah. And they're right there. And if you look into the history of what's happening.
But the Hamas 2.0 or whatever, you get rid of.
It could be worse, but they don't
fight Al-Qaeda, you get ISIS. We just have to be careful not to think and tell ourselves these false illusions because it made us puff our chest and feel good about ourselves. To actually ask the question of what job are we getting done? What is the mission we're getting done? What matters? And then go and have confidence about what we're actually doing and understand what we're not doing, or else you're going to tell yourself false myths, as we have for the last 25 years, that have led us astray. So that's just, I think we have to be really clear-eyed about this.
I think in the Hamas case, it's a little bit different. Just a little bit, because it can't really get much worse unless you're just talking about more money. As far as the ideology, as far as what they have done to the Jews, or as far as what they've said they will continue to do.
I mean, this is like an ISIS-like organization.
It's as bad as it gets, and there is no end. There is no possible. If it was someone who you thought could sit at the table, they could be reasoned with. It's no, exterminate all Jews. That includes women and children. We're going to put our weapons caches in our schools so that we can actually have our own.
We're
committing war crimes on both sides.
Dead wrong.
Yeah,
it's dead wrong.
And I agree with you on Ukraine, Russia. Same thing, even looking back.
And Israel's a very different situation than
Very
Ukraine.
different situation.
We're correct to stand with Israel in terms of our funding of their national self-defense.
But be aware if there's a vacuum.
In a way that we should for Ukraine.
Watch Slider with Crowder live Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. Eastern.